The morning fog clung to Camp Brennan like a wet blanket, muffling the sounds of boots on gravel and distant machinery warming up for another day. Warrant Officer Claire Donnelly adjusted her rucksack one final time and stepped through the main gate, her paperwork crisp in the manila folder tucked under her arm. 22 years of military service had taught her that first impressions mattered, especially when you were the outsider walking into an established unit. The base buzzed with the controlled chaos of a training facility. Soldiers moved between buildings with purpose, their conversations mixing with the diesel exhaust from idling vehicles. Claire had requested this assignment specifically, a quiet logistics position at a mid-sized training camp where she could finish out her final years of service without drama. After everything she'd been through, she craved the mundane predictability of supply schedules and equipment inventories. Her new supervisor, Master Sergeant Tony Reeves, was waiting for her outside the supply building. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of swagger that came from never having his authority seriously challenged. His handshake was firm but brief, his eyes already cataloging her appearance with the casual assessment of someone sizing up potential problems. "So you're our new logistics coordinator," he said, not quite making it sound like a question. "Hope you're ready to jump right in. We run a tight ship here, and I don't have time to hold anyone's hand through basic procedures." Claire nodded politely. She'd worked under dozens of supervisors over the years, and she could usually read them within the first 5 minutes. Reeves was the type who needed to establish dominance early, probably insecure about managing someone with more experience. Nothing she hadn't handled before. "I'm ready to get started, Sergeant," she replied. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports. Looks like you're running an efficient operation." As they walked toward the main office, Claire noticed the small silver pendant resting just above her name tape catch the filtered sunlight. It was a simple piece, a hawk in mid-dive, wings swept back, enclosed within what looked like a geometric lattice. She'd worn it so long that adjusting it had become an unconscious habit, like checking her watch or straightening her uniform. The office smelled of coffee and copy machine toner, with motivational posters covering walls that hadn't seen fresh paint in years. 3 other soldiers were clustered around the desk, their conversation dying as she entered. Reeves gestured toward them with the casual authority of someone introducing his territory. Corporal Jake Wilson, Specialist Lisa Martinez, and Private First Class Danny Brooks. They'll be working under you for inventory and distribution. He paused, letting that sink in. Under you, but through me. All decisions go through my desk first. Wilson, a stocky soldier with prematurely gray temples, glanced at the pendant and smirked slightly. "Nice jewelry, ma'am. Military regulation?" The question carried just enough edge to make it clear he wasn't asking out of genuine interest. Claire met his eyes steadily. "It's within regulations, Corporal." "Just checking," Wilson replied, his tone suggesting he found her answer amusing. "We get a lot of people through here who don't quite understand how things work at a real training facility." Martinez shot Wilson a warning look, but Brooks was already leaning forward with the eager cruelty of someone who'd found a target. "Is that supposed to be some kind of bird?" "Looks like something from a gift shop." Claire had heard worse. Much worse. In places where mockery was the least of her problems. She simply nodded once and turned her attention to Reeves. "When can we start the facility walkthrough?" But she could feel their eyes on the pendant, and she caught Wilson whispering something to Brooks that made both of them chuckle. The sound was familiar, the particular brand of casual cruelty that flourished in groups, where people assumed they were dealing with someone who couldn't fight back. Reeves led her through the supply areas with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd given the same tour dozens of times. He pointed out storage protocols, showed her the inventory computer system, and explained the daily reporting requirements with the kind of detail that suggested he didn't trust her to figure out basic procedures on her own. "One thing you need to understand," he said, as they stood in the main warehouse, "is that this isn't some desk job. We support live training exercises, and when the units need equipment, they need it fast, and they need it right. There's no margin for error." Claire nodded, making notes in her pocket notebook. Around them, the warehouse stretched out in organized rows of green canvas and black polymer cases. Everything was labeled, cataloged, and positioned according to a system that made sense once you understood the logic behind it. "What's the typical turnaround time for special requests?" she asked. "Depends on what they're asking for," Reeves replied. "Standard gear, same day. Anything that requires coordination with other bases or special authorization goes through me personally. And I mean personally. Every single request." There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't just about maintaining order. This was about control, about making sure everyone understood that nothing happened without his explicit approval. Claire filed that observation away for future reference. As they completed the tour, she noticed how the other soldiers interacted with Reeves. There was respect there, but it was the careful kind that came from knowing exactly where the lines were drawn and what happened to people who crossed them. Martinez kept her responses brief and professional. Brooks seemed eager to please, almost anxious about saying the wrong thing. Wilson maintained a facade of casual camaraderie, but Claire caught the way his jaw tightened when Reeves gave him direct orders. Back in the office, Reeves handed her a thick binder filled with regulations and procedures. "Your homework for tonight," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll expect you to be up to speed by tomorrow morning. We start inventory at 0600 sharp." Claire tucked the binder under her arm and prepared to leave. As she reached the door, Wilson's voice stopped her. "Ma'am, about that pendant. Is it some kind of family thing? Military tradition?" She turned back to face the room. All four of them were watching her now, waiting for an explanation that would satisfy their curiosity or confirm their assumptions about her being someone who needed to prove herself to them. "It's personal, Corporal," she said quietly. "Everything's personal until it affects the unit," Reeves interjected. "If it's going to be a distraction or cause problems with uniform standards, we need to address it now." Claire felt the familiar weight of having to justify something that needed no justification. But she also recognized the game being played. This wasn't about uniform regulations or unit cohesion. This was about testing boundaries, seeing how much pressure she could handle before she either pushed back or folded. "It's within regulations, Sergeant," she repeated. "Is there anything else you need from me today?" Reeves studied her for a long moment, probably trying to decide whether to push the issue further or save it for another day. Finally, he shrugged. "That's all for now. Don't be late tomorrow." As Claire walked across the base toward the temporary quarters she'd been assigned, she could feel the weight of first impressions settling around her like dust. The pendant felt heavier than usual, not because of its physical weight, but because of the attention it had drawn. She'd hoped to blend in, to find a quiet corner where she could do her job without having to explain or defend herself. But as she'd learned over 2 decades of military service, hope was a luxury that rarely survived contact with reality. The pendant wasn't just jewelry to her, and eventually, someone was going to ask questions she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. The only question was whether that someone would be friend or foe, and whether she'd have any choice in how much of her story she'd have to reveal. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cut through Claire's sleep at 5:15, just as it had for more years than she cared to count. She'd never needed the full snooze cycle. Military life had trained her body to wake up ready, whether she felt like it or not. Outside her temporary quarters window, The base was already stirring with the quiet efficiency of an organization that ran on schedules. Measured in minutes rather than hours. She dressed with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, checking her uniform in the small mirror mounted above the standard issue dresser. The pendant settled into its familiar position above her name tape, catching the fluorescent light from the overhead fixture. In a few hours, she'd be back in that office, and she had no illusions about what kind of reception was waiting for her. The mess hall served breakfast with military efficiency, hot, filling, and designed to fuel bodies that would spend a day moving heavy objects and solving logistical problems. Claire chose a table near the window where she could watch the morning shift changes while she ate. The conversations around her were typical military breakfast chatter. Complaints about the coffee, discussions of weekend plans, good-natured griping about upcoming training schedules. At 0600 precisely, she pushed through the supply office door to find Reeves already at his desk with a cup of coffee and what looked like overnight reports spread in front of him. He glanced up with the expression of someone who'd been hoping she might oversleep and give him a reason to establish his authority more firmly. Prompt. Good, he said, making it sound like punctuality was a personal favor she was doing him. Wilson's already started pulling inventory sheets for today's exercises. Martinez is checking equipment returns from yesterday. Brooks is handling basic maintenance. That leaves you with the fun job. He gestured toward a stack of requisition forms that looked thick enough to choke a horse. Special requests from visiting units. Some of these have been sitting here for weeks because nobody wants to deal with the paperwork. Figure out what we can fill, what we need to order, and what we're going to have to tell them they can't have. Claire settled at the desk he'd assigned. A metal monstrosity that had probably been installed sometime during the previous decade and showed every year of hard use. The requisition forms were a mess, some filled out correctly, others missing crucial information, a few that seemed to have been written by people who weren't entirely sure what they were asking for. Any particular priority system? She asked. Squeaky. Wheel gets the grease, Reeves replied without looking up from his own paperwork. The units that call the most get handled first. The ones that submit proper paperwork get handled properly. Everyone else gets handled when we feel like it. It was a system designed to create problems rather than solve them, but Claire had seen worse. She pulled the first form from the stack and began working through the details, cross-referencing part numbers and checking availability against their inventory database. The work was routine, almost meditative in its predictability. Wilson appeared at her desk around 8:30 with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he had something important to share. Ma'am, I've been thinking about your pendant situation. Claire continued typing without looking up. What situation is that, Corporal? Well, I did some research last night and I couldn't find any record of that particular design in any of the standard military jewelry catalogs. Makes me wonder if it might be some kind of unauthorized modification. The room had gone quiet. Martinez stopped shuffling papers. Brooks paused in his equipment inspection, and even Reeves looked up from his coffee with the interest of someone watching a potentially entertaining confrontation develop. Claire saved her work and turned to face Wilson fully. Are you filing a formal complaint about my uniform, Corporal? Just raising a question about standards, Wilson replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. He'd probably expected her to get defensive or try to explain herself, not respond with the kind of direct question that required him to either commit to his position or back down. Then I suggest you research the relevant regulations and submit your concerns through proper channels, Claire said calmly. Is there anything else you need help with regarding today's inventory? Wilson glanced toward Reeves, clearly hoping for backup that didn't materialize. The sergeant was watching the exchange with the detached interest of someone waiting to see how it played out before deciding which side to support. "No, ma'am," Wilson finally said. "Just trying to maintain unit standards." "Understood. Thank you for your diligence." The formality in her response carried just enough edge to make it clear the conversation was over, but not enough to give anyone grounds for complaint. Wilson retreated to his own desk, but Claire could feel him watching her for the rest of the morning, probably trying to figure out why his attempt at intimidation had bounced off her like rain off a windshield. Around 10:30, a captain from one of the visiting training units stopped by to check on a special equipment request his people had submitted. Claire pulled his paperwork and discovered it had been sitting in the pile for almost 3 weeks without anyone bothering to process it. "Let me make some calls," she told him. "I should have an answer for you within the hour." It took 45 minutes of phone conversations and database searches to track down everything on his list. Some items were available locally, others could be transferred from a sister facility, and a few required special authorization that she was able to expedite through channels she remembered from previous assignments. When she handed the captain his completed forms, his relief was obvious. "Thank you, Warrant Officer. I was starting to think we'd have to modify our entire training schedule." "Just doing my job, sir." But Reeves had been listening to her phone calls, and his expression suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with her efficiency. After the captain left, he appeared at her desk with his arms folded. "In the future, I'd appreciate being consulted before you start making promises about delivery times," he said. "We have procedures for a reason." "Of course, Sergeant. I assume time-sensitive requests took priority over administrative process. Everything goes through me first. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Sergeant." The confrontation was brief and professional, but everyone in the office had witnessed it. Martinez gave Claire a subtle nod of support when Reeves wasn't looking, while Brooks seemed disappointed that the conflict had resolved without more drama. Wilson just watched with the calculating expression of someone filing away information for future use. Lunch came and went without incident, but the afternoon brought a new wrinkle. A master sergeant from the base logistics command stopped by to review their quarterly reports, and his questions revealed some discrepancies in equipment tracking that went back several months. Missing signatures, items logged as returned but not accounted for in inventory, requisition forms that had been approved but never processed. Claire found herself pulled into the discussion, partly because she was the newest member of the team, and partly because her questions about the existing systems had touched on some of the same issues the inspector was raising. She answered carefully, sticking to what she could verify from the records rather than speculating about problems she'd only begun to identify. But when the inspector left, Reeves was clearly agitated. "I hope you don't think you're going to come in here and start pointing fingers at how we've been doing business," he said. "I'm just trying to understand the system, Sergeant. If there are process improvements that could help us avoid future problems, the systems work fine when people follow them correctly," Reeves interrupted. "Maybe instead of worrying about jewelry and impressing visiting officers, you should focus on learning how things actually work around here." The comment about the pendant was deliberate, designed to remind everyone in the room about their earlier conversations and keep the focus on her as an outsider who didn't understand local customs. Claire recognized the tactic to deflect attention from systemic problems by making the discussion personal. "Understood, Sergeant. Is there anything specific you'd like me to prioritize?" "I want you to double-check all the equipment returns from the past month. Make sure everything that's supposed to be here is actually here, and everything that's logged as returned has the proper paperwork." It was busy work, designed to keep her occupied with details while the real decisions got made without her input. But Claire had played these games before, and she understood that sometimes the best response was patience rather than resistance. As the day ended and the office began to empty, Martinez lingered by Claire's desk. "Don't take it personally," she said quietly. "He does this with everyone new. Tests boundaries, sees how much pressure people can handle. Appreciate the heads up," Claire replied. "That pendant," Martinez continued, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "It's not military issue, is it?" Claire looked up from her paperwork. Martinez's question carried genuine curiosity rather than the challenging tone Wilson had used earlier. "No, it's not." "Didn't think so. I've never seen anything like it." Martinez paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Look, I don't know what your story is, and it's none of my business. But around here, anything that makes you stand out becomes a target. Just something to keep in mind." It was good advice, delivered by someone who clearly understood the social dynamics of their workplace. Claire appreciated both the warning and the way it had been offered, without judgment or demands for explanation. "Thanks, Lisa. I'll keep that in mind." As she walked back to her quarters that evening, Claire reflected on her first full day. The work itself was routine, well within her capabilities. The interpersonal dynamics were more complicated, but not unprecedented. She'd worked in hostile environments before, places where her competence was questioned and her presence resented. The difference was that in those other places, the stakes had been life and death. Here, the worst that could happen was administrative inconvenience and professional friction. She could handle that. The question was whether she wanted to, and whether the peaceful assignment she'd been hoping for was worth the energy it would take to establish her place in this particular hierarchy. The pendant caught the evening light. As she unlocked her door, and for a moment, she considered Martinez's advice about standing out. But taking it off felt like surrender, and surrender had never been her style. Whatever came next, she'd face it as herself, with all the complications that entailed. The third week at Camp Brennan brought the kind of autumn weather that made morning formations feel like punishment, cold enough to make you wish for better gear, but not quite cold enough to justify breaking out the heavy jackets. Claire arrived at the supply office to find an unusual level of activity for 7 in the morning. Brooks was hauling equipment crates from the warehouse. Martinez was on the phone with someone who seemed to require a lot of patient explanation. And Wilson was standing over a spread of inventory sheets with the concentrated expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle he didn't entirely understand. Reeves looked up from his desk with the kind of smile that immediately put her on guard. "Perfect timing, Donnelly. We've got a situation that's right in your wheelhouse." He gestured toward a stack of paperwork that looked significantly more official than their usual requisition forms. Emergency equipment request from Colonel Marcus Stratham's office. They're running a joint training exercise next week with some NATO liaison officers, and apparently someone screwed up the original equipment order. They need a complete gear package for 40 personnel, including specialized communications equipment and tactical harnesses. Claire scanned the requirements list, noting the tight timeline and specific equipment standards. It was the kind of request that required careful coordination and couldn't afford mistakes. When do they need delivery? Day after tomorrow. Oh, and here's the fun part: half of this stuff isn't in our standard inventory. You're going to have to source it from other facilities and coordinate transportation. Wilson looked up from his inventory sheets. Shouldn't be too hard for someone with logistics experience, he said, his tone managing to make it sound like he had serious doubts about her logistics experience. Claire studied the paperwork more carefully, cross-referencing requirements against their available stock. The request was complex, but not impossible, assuming everything went smoothly with interbase coordination and assuming no one made any critical errors in the process. "I'll need access to the priority communications channels for facility coordination," she said. Already arranged, Reeves replied. You've got full authority to make whatever calls you need to make. Consider this your chance to show us what real logistics coordination looks like. There was something in his tone that made her cautious. This felt less like an opportunity and more like a test, the kind where the parameters were designed to create problems rather than solve them. But she'd requested this assignment specifically because she wanted to do actual logistics work, and complaining about getting exactly what she'd asked for would send the wrong message. She spent the morning mapping out, sourcing strategies, and making initial contact calls to other bases. Some of the required equipment was available locally, but the specialized communications gear would have to come from a facility 2 states away, and the tactical harnesses required a specific manufacturer certification that limited her options. The 3 potential sources by noon. She'd identified suppliers for everything on the list and had preliminary commitments for delivery, schedules that would meet the Colonel's timeline. The coordination was complex, requiring careful timing and backup plans for potential transportation delays. But it was exactly the kind of problem-solving that had drawn her to logistics work in the first place. Wilson appeared at her desk during lunch with a concerned expression. "Ma'am, I've been looking at some of those communications requirements, and I think there might be a problem." He spread out a technical specification sheet that detailed power requirements and interface protocols for the requested equipment. According to this, the units you're sourcing from Fort Henderson won't be compatible with the base systems here. Different voltage requirements, different connector types. Claire studied the specifications carefully. Wilson was right about the technical details, but there was something in his presentation that felt rehearsed, like he'd been waiting for the right moment to reveal information he'd been holding back. "When did you identify this incompatibility issue?" she asked. "Just now, when I was double-checking the technical specs. These specification sheets were available yesterday when we started planning. Did anyone review them at that time?" Wilson glanced toward Reeves' desk, but the sergeant was conveniently involved in a phone conversation that kept him from participating in their discussion. "I guess it got overlooked in the rush to get everything organized," Wilson said. Claire felt the familiar sensation of recognizing a setup in progress. The technical incompatibility was real, but the timing of its discovery was suspicious. Someone had known about this problem from the beginning and had chosen to let her proceed with planning that was doomed to fail. "Thank you for catching this, Corporal," she said evenly. "I'll adjust the sourcing plan accordingly." The adjustment required canceling her arrangements with Fort Henderson and finding alternative suppliers for equipment that was now in much shorter supply. 3 phone calls and 2 hours of negotiation later, she'd managed to locate compatible units at a facility in Virginia. But the delivery schedule would be tight, and the cost would be significantly higher. Reeves finished his phone call and wandered over to check on her progress. "Everything still on track?" "We had a compatibility issue with the communications equipment, but I've found alternative sources. Delivery will still meet the timeline, but costs will be about 30% higher than originally estimated." 30%? Reeves raised his eyebrows in theatrical concern. "That's a significant budget impact. Are you sure there isn't a more cost-effective solution?" Claire recognized the position she was being placed in. Accept the higher costs and take responsibility for a budget overrun or compromise on equipment, standards, and risk delivering gear that wouldn't meet the Colonel's requirements. "I can continue searching for alternatives, but that might impact our delivery timeline," she said. "What's the priority, budget or schedule?" "Both," Reeves replied with a shrug. "That's what makes it challenging." Brooks had been listening to their conversation while pretending to organize equipment catalogs. "Maybe the problem is trying to do too much too fast," he suggested. If this was planned properly from the beginning, the implication was clear. The problems they were facing resulted from poor planning on Claire's part, not from deliberate sabotage or unrealistic expectations. She could feel the dynamic in the room shifting as the narrative took shape. The new person who'd promised to handle a complex request but was now struggling with basic logistics coordination. "I'll find a solution," Claire said simply. The rest of the afternoon was spent on the phone with suppliers, transportation coordinators, and equipment specialists. She managed to identify a source for compatible communications gear at costs that split the difference between her original estimates and the inflated Virginia prices. But it required calling in favors with people she'd worked with at previous assignments and agreeing to expedited shipping that left no margin for error. By closing time, she had confirmation on all required equipment with delivery schedules that would meet Colonel Stratham's requirements and costs that stayed within reasonable budget parameters. It had required 12 hours of intensive coordination and had consumed most of her goodwill with suppliers at 3 different facilities. But the job was done. Reeves reviewed her final coordination plan with the expression of someone who'd been hoping for a different outcome. "This looks workable," he admitted, "assuming nothing goes wrong with any of the deliveries." "There are backup plans for the critical items," Claire replied. "If the primary shipments are delayed, we can source locally and upgrade to specifications at delivery." Good thinking. His tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with her good thinking. As the office cleared out for the evening, Martinez stopped by Claire's desk. "That was impressive," she said quietly. "Most people would have thrown up their hands when that compatibility issue surfaced." "Just doing the job," Claire replied. "Right. Except the job wasn't supposed to be doable." Martinez glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. "That compatibility problem didn't just get discovered today. Wilson's been aware of it since the request came in. I saw him reviewing those technical specs on Tuesday." Claire wasn't surprised by the confirmation, but hearing it stated directly was different from suspecting it. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because what happened today wasn't about testing your logistics skills. It was about setting you up to fail and then blaming the failure on your inexperience or incompetence." Martinez paused. "I don't know why, and I don't know what they have against you personally, but you should know that this isn't normal hazing or professional development. This is something else." The conversation stayed with Claire as she walked back to her quarters. She'd suspected from the beginning that the assignment was designed to create problems, but having that suspicion confirmed changed the stakes. This wasn't just about proving her competence or establishing her place in the office hierarchy. This was about people actively working to undermine her success. The pendant felt heavier as she prepared for bed, weighted not just with its own significance, but with the growing realization that her quiet assignment was turning into something more complicated. Tomorrow would bring the actual equipment deliveries, and she had no illusions about what would happen if anything went wrong. But she'd handled worse situations with higher stakes and fewer resources. Whatever game was being played here, she was prepared to see it through to the end. The only question was what the end would look like, and whether she'd be the one left standing when the dust settled. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything look sharper, including the tension in the supply office. Claire arrived early to coordinate the incoming equipment deliveries, only to find Reeves already at his desk with a cup of coffee and an expression that suggested he hadn't slept particularly well. "Status report," he said without preamble. "First delivery truck arrives at 0900 with the communications equipment from Virginia. Second truck at 11:30 with the tactical harnesses from Fort Campbell. Local pickup for miscellaneous. Item starts at 1400. Claire consulted her notes. "Everything's on schedule for completion by 1600, 2 hours ahead of the Colonel's deadline." "Outstanding," Reeves replied, but his tone suggested he found the news less than outstanding. "I'll be in meetings most of the day, so you'll..." Be handling the coordination independently. Try not to let anything slip through the cracks. Wilson and Brooks arrived together, their conversation cutting off abruptly when they noticed Claire at her desk. There was something in their demeanor that reminded her of students who'd spent the night before an exam plotting ways to ensure their classmate failed. Big day, Wilson observed. A lot of moving parts, a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong. That's why we plan for contingencies, Claire replied. Right, but you can't plan for everything. Sometimes equipment shows up damaged, sometimes drivers get lost, sometimes the paperwork doesn't match what actually gets delivered. Wilson's tone was conversational, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation that made his comments feel more like predictions than concerns. The first delivery truck arrived precisely on schedule, which should have been good news. The driver was professional. The equipment manifest matched Claire's orders, and the communications gear appeared to be in perfect condition. But when she opened the cases for inspection, she discovered that while the equipment model numbers were correct, the software configurations were locked to frequencies that wouldn't interface with CAMP. Brennan's communication protocols. It was a subtle problem, the kind that wouldn't be discovered until someone actually tried to use the equipment in the field. The hardware was perfect, the paperwork was perfect, but the systems integration was impossible. Claire spent 20 minutes on the phone with the supplier, working through technical specifications and trying to understand how the misconfiguration had occurred. The conversation was frustrating but informative. Apparently, the equipment had been specially configured for a different facility and had never been reset to standard parameters. We can reprogram the units remotely, the supplier's technical support representative offered. It'll take about 3 hours and require coordination with your base communications officer. 3 hours would put them past the delivery deadline, and coordinating with base communications would require explanations about why the equipment needed emergency reprogramming. Claire could handle the technical aspects, but the political implications were more complicated. Wilson appeared at her desk just as she was finishing the phone call. Problems with the CUM gear? Software configuration issue. It's being resolved. Software configuration. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. That's the kind of thing that should have been caught during the initial specifications review, isn't it? The comment was delivered with perfect innocence, but Claire understood its implications. Someone reviewing the conversation later would note that proper planning should have identified potential configuration problems before equipment was ordered and shipped. These configurations are typically handled automatically during the fulfillment process, Claire replied. The supplier's technical team is correcting the issue now. Good thing you caught it before delivery to the colonel's people. That could have been embarrassing. The second delivery arrived on schedule, but with its own set of problems. The tactical harnesses were the correct model and met all the specified requirements, but 12 of the 40 units showed signs of wear that suggested they'd been used in previous exercises and returned to inventory without proper inspection. The wear wasn't severe enough to compromise safety, but it was visible enough that anyone conducting a detailed inspection would notice. Claire documented the issues and contacted the supplier, who confirmed that the harnesses had indeed been refurbished units rather than new equipment. According to their records, her original order had specified serviceable condition rather than new manufacture, which technically met the contract requirements but didn't match her understanding of what had been requested. I can arrange replacement units, the supplier offered, but delivery would be Monday at the earliest. Monday was 3 days past the colonel's deadline, which made replacement impossible. Claire accepted the refurbished units and made detailed notes about their condition, but she knew that explaining why some of the equipment showed previous use would require careful documentation. Brooks had been observing the harness inspection with obvious interest. "Think the colonel's people will notice the wear marks?" he asked. "Everything will be documented in the delivery report," Claire replied. "Sure, but will they read the delivery report before they start using the equipment? Sometimes people just assume that if it comes from supply, it must be perfect. The afternoon brought the local pickups, which should have been the easiest part of the coordination. Claire had arranged to collect miscellaneous items from 3 different locations on base, all standard equipment that was readily available and frequently issued. But the first stop revealed that half of the requested items had been transferred to another facility the previous day without updating their inventory system. The transfer had been authorized through proper channels and was completely legitimate, but it hadn't been communicated to anyone handling current requisitions. Claire found herself scrambling to locate alternative sources for equipment that should have been simple to obtain. By 1500, she had managed to source everything on the Colonel's requirements list, but the process had required compromises on every major item. The communications equipment would work, but required special configuration. The tactical harnesses were functional, but showed previous use. The miscellaneous items came from multiple sources, with varying condition reports. Reeves returned from his meetings, just as she was completing the final paperwork. How did we make out? Everything on the requirements list will be delivered by 1600 as scheduled, Claire reported. There were some complications, but they've all been resolved. Complications? Claire provided a brief summary of the issues she'd encountered and the solutions she'd implemented. Reeves listened with the expression of someone who was hearing exactly what he'd expected to hear, but not necessarily what he'd hoped to hear. So we're delivering used equipment that requires special setup and came from multiple sources instead of coordinated procurement. He summarized, that's not exactly the seamless logistics coordination we promised the Colonel's office. It meets all specified requirements and will be fully functional for the training exercise, Claire replied. The delivery report will document any condition issues and setup requirements. I'm sure it will. Reeves picked up the phone. Colonel? Stratham's office? This is Master Sergeant Reeves at Base Supply. I wanted to give you a heads up about your equipment delivery this afternoon. Claire couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she could see Reeves' expression as he explained the various complications and compromises that had been necessary to meet the delivery timeline. His tone was professional and apologetic, the voice of someone doing their best to manage a difficult situation that had been created by factors beyond their control. When he hung up, his expression was grave. The Colonel wants to review the equipment personally before accepting delivery. He'll be here at 1700. An hour before closing time, with the equipment staged for delivery and the paperwork completed. Colonel Marcus Stratham's personal inspection would determine whether the past 3 days of intensive coordination had been successful or whether Claire's first major assignment would be recorded as a failure due to inadequate planning and execution. Wilson was practically bouncing with anticipation. Personal inspection by a colonel, he mused. That's not something you see every day. Hope everything meets his standards. Claire spent the remaining hour organizing the equipment for optimal presentation and preparing to explain the circumstances that had led to each compromise. She had documentation for everything, justification for every decision, and backup plans for potential problems. But as she watched the clock move towards 1700, she couldn't shake the feeling that the inspection would reveal problems she hadn't anticipated, problems that would make all her careful planning and documentation irrelevant. The sound of a vehicle pulling up outside the supply building announced the Colonel's arrival, and Claire knew that the next hour would determine whether her assignment at Camp Brennan continued, or whether she'd be looking for a new duty station much sooner than expected. Colonel Marcus Stratham stepped through the supply office door with the kind of presence that made everyone in the room instinctively straighten their posture. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with gray threading through his dark hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent making decisions under pressure. His uniform was immaculate, and he moved with the economical grace of someone who'd learned to waste neither time nor energy on unnecessary gestures. Reeves was on his feet immediately, snapping to attention with the kind of precision that suggested he'd been practicing. "Good evening, sir. Master Sergeant Reeves, Base Supply Operations." "At ease, Sergeant." Stratham's voice carried the easy authority of someone who didn't need to raise it to command attention. His eyes swept the office, taking in the assembled personnel before settling on the equipment staged near the loading dock. "I understand we've had some interesting developments with my equipment request." "Yes, sir. Warrant Officer Donnelly has been coordinating the sourcing and delivery. She can brief you on the details." Claire stepped forward, acutely aware that Wilson, Brooks, and Martinez were watching from their positions around the office. This was the moment they'd all been building toward. The test that would determine whether her careful work over the past 3 days would be recognized as professional problem-solving or dismissed as inadequate execution. "Sir, all equipment on your requirements list has been sourced and is ready for delivery," she began. There were some procurement challenges that required alternative sourcing, but everything meets your operational specifications. Stratham nodded and walked toward the equipment staging area. "Show me what we're working with." Claire led him through the communications equipment first, explaining the software configuration issues and the remote programming that had been necessary to ensure compatibility with base systems. She kept her explanation technical but accessible, focusing on solutions rather than problems. The programming was completed this afternoon and tested with base communications. All units are fully functional and ready for field deployment. Stratham picked up one of the radio units, turning it over in his hands with the familiarity of someone who'd handled similar equipment in operational environments. He powered it on, cycled through several frequency settings, and nodded approvingly at the clear signal response. "This is exactly what we need," he said. "Sometimes non-standard configurations work better than factory defaults anyway." Claire felt a small surge of relief, but she knew the tactical harnesses would be a harder sell. She led Stratham to the next staging area and addressed the condition issues directly. The tactical harnesses meet all safety and functional requirements, but 12 of the 40 units show signs of previous use. The supplier classified them as refurbished rather than new manufacture, which technically met our procurement specifications, but may not have matched your expectations. She handed him the detailed condition report she prepared, highlighting which units showed where and what kind of inspection had been conducted to verify their operational readiness. Stratham examined several of the harnesses, checking buckles, stress points, and webbing with the thoroughness of someone who understood that equipment failure in the field could have serious consequences. His inspection was more detailed than Claire had expected, and she found herself impressed by his technical knowledge. "Refurbished gear can actually be more reliable than new equipment," he said finally. "It's been field tested in any manufacturing. Defects have already been identified and corrected. As long as the inspection standards are adequate, I prefer it." The miscellaneous equipment review went smoothly, partly because Claire had managed to source everything from reputable suppliers, and partly because Stratham seemed more interested in functionality than cosmetic perfection. He asked detailed questions about procurement timelines, supplier reliability, and backup planning that demonstrated both technical expertise and strategic thinking. When they'd completed the equipment review, Stratham turned back to Claire with an expression that had shifted from professional assessment to something more personal. "Warrant Officer, how long have you been in logistics?" 22 years, sir. "And before this assignment?" Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second, aware that Reeves, Wilson, and the others were listening carefully. "Various postings, sir. Most recently overseas deployment. overseas deployment. Stratham repeated the phrase thoughtfully, his eyes dropping briefly to the pendant at her collarbone before returning to her face. What kind of logistics work were you doing overseas? The question was casual enough, but there was something in his tone that suggested more than routine curiosity. Claire felt the familiar tension that came when conversations moved toward subjects she preferred not to discuss in detail. Supply chain coordination, sir. Equipment and personnel movement in complex operational environments. It was an accurate description that revealed nothing specific about where she'd been or what she'd been doing. But as she spoke, she noticed Stratham's attention focusing more intently on the pendant, his expression shifting from professional interest to something that looked almost like recognition. "That's an interesting piece of jewelry," he said, his voice quieter now. "Family significance?" Claire felt the familiar weight of having to explain something that couldn't be explained, not without revealing information that was supposed to remain classified. "It has personal meaning, sir. I'm sure it does." Stratham stepped closer, close enough that he could examine the pendant's design more clearly. The hawk in mid-dive, wings swept back, and closed within the geometric lattice that most people assumed, was decorative rather than symbolic. For several long seconds, the office was completely silent. Everyone was watching Stratham study the pendant with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to casual curiosity about jewelry. Claire could feel her heart rate increasing, not from fear, but from the recognition that something significant was happening. When Stratham finally looked up, his expression had changed completely. The professional courtesy was still there, but underneath it was something that looked like surprise mixed with respect and perhaps a touch of awe. "Warrant officer," he said, carefully, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" It wasn't really a request, and Claire understood that the conversation that was about to happen would determine not just the success of her equipment delivery, but potentially the entire trajectory of her assignment at Camp Brennan. "Of course, sir." Stratham glanced around the office at the assembled personnel. "Sergeant Reeves, please have your people finish the equipment loading. The delivery is approved as coordinated." The dismissal was polite but absolute, and within minutes the office had cleared except for Claire and the colonel. When the door closed behind the last departing soldier, Stratham turned back to her with an expression that was completely different from the one he'd worn during the equipment. "Review, Operation Lattice Hawk," he said quietly. "Northern Sector, 06 through 08. The words hit Claire like a physical blow, not because they were threatening, but because they represented something she thought was buried so deeply that it would never surface again. Operation Lattice Hawk had been classified so far beyond normal military secrecy that officially it had never existed. "Sir, I'm not sure what you're referring to. Don't." His voice was gentle but firm. "I was intelligence liaison for the Northern Command during that time frame. I've seen that pendant before, and I know what it represents. Only 7 were ever issued, and 4 of the people who earned them didn't make it home." Claire felt the ground shifting beneath her, not just because her carefully constructed cover was being penetrated, but because she was face to face with someone who understood exactly what that pendant meant and why she'd never been able to take it off. "The operation never existed, sir," she said carefully. "That's what all the paperwork says." "The paperwork says a lot of things." Stratham moved to the window, looking out at the base where soldiers were going about their evening routines in blissful ignorance of the conversation taking place inside the supply office. "But I remember the intelligence reports. 43 Allied personnel extracted from a situation that should have been impossible to survive. Supply lines established through terrain that couldn't be traversed. Equipment and medical supplies delivered to coordinates that weren't supposed to exist." He turned back to face her. "You weren't just doing logistics, warrant officer. You were performing miracles under fire, and you did it so well that most of the people you saved never knew. Who was responsible for keeping them alive? The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of things that couldn't be said officially, but were understood perfectly by both people in the room. Claire had spent years learning to deflect conversations that moved in this direction, but there was something about Stratham's tone that made standard deflection feel insufficient. "I did my job, sir," she said finally. "My team did the hard work. Your team wouldn't have made it within 50 kilometers of the hard work without the coordination you provided. We studied those supply route maps for months afterward. Hell, some people are probably still studying them." Stratham paused. "You didn't just move equipment and supplies. You bent time and space to make impossible things happen on impossible schedules." Claire found herself caught between the instinct to maintain operational security and the strange relief of talking to someone who actually understood what she'd been through. It had been years since she'd spoken to anyone who knew the real story behind her last overseas deployment. "I'm here on routine administrative assignment, sir," she said. "That's all." Stratham nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he didn't believe the word routine belonged anywhere near her personnel file. "I'm sure that's what the paperwork says. But after what I saw today, the way you handled a complex coordination problem under pressure, the backup planning, the creative problem solving, I think we're wasting your talents on routine administrative work." Claire felt a familiar tension building, the kind that came when she sensed her carefully constructed quiet assignment was about to become something more complicated. "Sir, I requested this posting specifically because you wanted to disappear," Stratham interrupted gently. "I understand that. After what you've been through, after what you've accomplished, the appeal of anonymous routine work makes perfect sense. But sometimes the military has other plans." The conversation was moving in a direction that made Claire deeply uncomfortable. Not because she feared the consequences, but because she'd worked so hard to build a life that didn't require her to be extraordinary every single day. "What kind of other plans, sir?" Stratham smiled for the first time since he'd entered the office, but it was the kind of smile that suggested he was about to turn someone's world upside down. "We'll discuss that tomorrow, warrant officer. Report to my office at 0800. We're going to talk about putting your skills to use in ways that matter." As he moved toward the door, he paused and looked back at her. "And Donnelly? Don't worry about Sergeant Reeves or his people. After today's performance, I think their opinions about your qualifications may be subject to revision." The door closed behind him, leaving Claire alone in the supply office with the growing realization that her quiet assignment at camp Brennan was about to become anything but quiet. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that made everything look washed out and indistinct. Claire made her way across the base toward the command building, her mind cycling through possible explanations for Colonel Stratham's summons. In her experience, when senior officers wanted to discuss putting your skills to use in ways that matter, it usually meant the end of whatever peaceful assignment you thought you'd secured. The command building was a study in military efficiency. Polished floors, precisely hung photographs of current and former commanders, and a kind of institutional quiet that suggested important decisions were made here on a regular basis. Claire announced herself to the duty sergeant and was directed to a waiting area outside Stratham's office. At precisely 0800, the colonel's door opened and he gestured her inside. His office was larger than she'd expected, with windows overlooking the main parade ground and walls lined with military maps, commendation certificates, and photographs from various deployments. A coffee service was set up on a side table, and 2 chairs were positioned facing each other, near the windows rather than across his desk. "Coffee?" Stratham offered, already pouring himself a cup. "Thank you, sir." As they settled into the chairs, Claire noticed that Stratham's demeanor was different from the previous evening. Less formal, more collaborative, as if the revelation about her background had shifted their relationship from superior-subordinate to something more like professional consultation. "I spent some time last night making phone calls," he began, "tracking down people who might remember Operation Lattice Hawk, or at least remember the intelligence reports that came out of that region during the time frame we discussed." Claire kept her expression neutral, but she felt the familiar tension that came when classified operations became subjects of conversation with people who weren't supposed to know they'd existed. "It's remarkable how many people remember logistics miracles, but can't quite recall who was responsible for them," Stratham continued. "Almost like someone went to considerable trouble to keep certain names out of certain reports. Operational security protocols can be quite thorough, sir. Yes, they can be. Especially when the operations in question weren't supposed to exist. In the first place," Stratham sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "But here's the interesting thing about classified operations. While the details stay buried, the people who were there remember. And some of those people are now in positions where their memories matter." Claire wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but she had a growing suspicion that her quiet assignment was about to be officially terminated. "Sir, if there's been some concern about my security clearance or my suitability for this posting, quite the opposite." Stratham set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. "I've been authorized to offer you a position that would make better use of your actual qualifications." He stood and moved to a wall map that showed the southeastern United States with various military installations marked in different colors. "We're establishing a new multi-service logistics coordination center. The mission is to streamline equipment and personnel movement for joint training exercises, NATO coordination, and emergency response operations." Claire studied the map, noting the complexity of the coordination networks that would be required to manage logistics across multiple services and allied partners. It was exactly the kind of challenging, high-visibility work she'd been trying to avoid. "It sounds like an important mission, sir, but I'm not sure. The position comes with a promotion to Chief Warrant Officer and assignment as Deputy Director of Operations." Stratham continued as if she hadn't spoken. "You'd be responsible for developing coordination protocols, training personnel, and managing real-time logistics for operations that matter." The offer was generous, probably more generous than anything she'd been offered in years. It was also exactly the kind of responsibility that would put her back in the spotlight. Dealing with complex operations where mistakes had serious consequences and success required the kind of intensive coordination that had nearly burned her out during her previous assignment. "Sir, I appreciate the confidence you're showing in my abilities, but I requested assignment to Camp Brennan, specifically because I wanted to step back from high-intensity logistics work." Stratham returned to his chair and studied her with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing past her careful diplomatic language to the real concerns underneath. "You're afraid you can't do it anymore," he said quietly. "After what you went through overseas, after the pressure and the impossible deadlines and the constant knowledge that people were depending on you to perform miracles, you're worried that you don't have another miracle left in you." The accuracy of his assessment was uncomfortable, but Claire had to acknowledge that he wasn't entirely wrong. Her last deployment had ended with 43 people alive who wouldn't have been without her work, but it had also ended with her questioning whether she could maintain that level of performance indefinitely. "It's not a question of capability, sir. It's a question of sustainability. I understand that. But consider this. What you did overseas was perform under impossible conditions with inadequate resources and no backup support. What I'm offering you is the chance to build systems that prevent those impossible situations from developing in the first place." Stratham pulled a folder from his desk and handed it to her. "Take a look at the operational parameters. This isn't about crisis management. It's about creating coordination frameworks that make crises unnecessary. Claire opened the folder and found herself looking at organizational charts, mission statements, and operational concepts that represented exactly the kind of systematic approach to logistics coordination she'd always believed the military needed. Instead of reactive crisis management, the proposed center would focus on predictive planning and preventive coordination. The goal is to eliminate the kinds of situations where someone has to perform miracles to keep people alive, Stratham explained. We want to build systems so robust that extraordinary individual performance becomes unnecessary rather than essential. It was an appealing vision, but Claire had enough experience to know that even the best systems required people capable of extraordinary performance when unexpected situations arose. And if the systems fail? If unexpected situations develop despite all the planning and coordination? Then we need people who know how to perform miracles, Stratham replied. But the difference is that they'll have proper resources, adequate support, and backup systems that make the miracles achievable rather than desperate. Claire studied the organizational charts more carefully, noting the emphasis on cross-service coordination and the integration of allied partners. It was ambitious, complex, and exactly the kind of challenge that would have excited her. Before her last deployment had taught her the personal costs of accepting such challenges. When would you need an answer, sir? Take the weekend. Think it over, discuss it with anyone you trust, and let me know Monday morning. Stratham paused. But while you're thinking, consider this: yesterday, you took a deliberately sabotaged assignment and turned it into a successful logistics coordination exercise. You did it under pressure, with inadequate resources, and while dealing with people who were actively working against your success. Claire looked up from the folder, startled by his blunt assessment of what had happened with the equipment delivery. You knew the assignment was sabotaged. I suspected it from the beginning. When a warrant officer with your background gets assigned to routine supply work and immediately gets handed a complex coordination challenge with unrealistic timelines, it raises questions. Stratham's expression was grim. What I didn't know was whether you'd rise to the challenge or allow yourself to be defeated by it. The revelation that her test had been a test changed everything about how Claire understood the past few days. The equipment problems, the tight timeline, even Reeves' attitude, all of it had been orchestrated to see how she'd respond under pressure. Why? She asked. Because we needed to know if the person behind Operation Latticehawk was still capable of performing at that level, or if we were dealing with someone who'd been broken by their experiences and was just going through the motions. Claire felt a flash of anger at being manipulated, but it was tempered by understanding of the military's need to assess personnel capabilities before assigning critical responsibilities. And your assessment? Yesterday, you demonstrated that. You're not just capable of performing at that level. You're capable of performing at that level while maintaining professional composure under deliberate sabotage. Stratham smiled. That's not someone who's been broken by their experiences. That's someone who's been strengthened by them. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Stratham's aide entered with a message that required immediate attention, providing Claire with a natural opportunity to take her leave as she prepared to go. Stratham handed her a business card with contact information for several people she could call if she wanted to discuss the position with personnel who'd worked similar assignments. The offer is real, Donnelly, and the mission matters. But more importantly, you matter. Don't let fear of past struggles prevent you from accepting future opportunities. Claire walked back across the base toward the supply office with her mind churning through implications and possibilities. The position Stratham had offered represented everything she'd once wanted from her military career: significant responsibility, important work, and the opportunity to build systems that would prevent other people from facing the impossible situations. She'd survived, but it also represented everything she'd been trying to escape: high pressure, complex coordination, and the constant weight of knowing that other people's lives depended on her ability to perform consistently at an extraordinary level. As she approached the supply office, she could see Reeves through the window, apparently briefing Wilson and Brooks on some new assignment. For a moment, she considered what it would mean to stay, to continue working in an environment where her competence was questioned and her contributions were minimized. The pendant caught the morning light as she reached for the door handle, and she found herself thinking about the people who'd worn similar pendants and hadn't made it home. They'd faced impossible situations with courage and competence, not because they were seeking recognition or advancement, but because the mission required it, and they were the people capable of getting it done. Maybe the question wasn't whether she could handle another high-pressure assignment. Maybe the question was whether she could live with herself if she turned down the opportunity to build systems that would prevent other people from facing the impossible situations she'd survived. The door to the supply office opened, and Claire stepped inside to face whatever the rest of her assignment at Camp Brennan would bring. Monday morning brought unseasonably warm weather and the kind of clear skies that made everything look possible. Claire arrived at the supply office to find an atmosphere that was noticeably different from the previous week. Reeves was at his desk as usual, but his demeanor had shifted from casual hostility to something more cautious. Wilson and Brooks were present but subdued, their earlier swagger replaced by an uncertainty that suggested they'd heard rumors about Friday's meeting with Colonel Stratham. Claire had spent the weekend thinking about the position offer, making phone calls to the references Stratham had provided, and ultimately reaching a decision that surprised even her. But first, she had some unfinished business to handle with her current assignment. "Good morning, Sergeant," she said as she settled at her desk. "I understand there were some questions about Friday's equipment delivery." Reeves looked up from his paperwork with an expression that was carefully neutral. The colonel seemed satisfied with the coordination. Everything went smoothly from his perspective. "I'm glad to hear that, but I'm more interested in discussing the coordination from our perspective." Claire opened her laptop and pulled up the files she'd been working on over the weekend. Specifically, the series of problems that developed during the sourcing and delivery process. Wilson glanced up from his inventory sheets, and Brooks paused in his equipment inspection. Martinez continued working, but Claire could see her listening carefully to the conversation. "Problems develop in complex logistics operations," Reeves said. "That's why we plan for contingencies." "Absolutely. But some problems develop because of inadequate planning, and others develop because of deliberate sabotage." Claire's tone was conversational, but there was an edge underneath that made it clear this wasn't a casual discussion. "I've been reviewing the timeline of issues we encountered, and I've identified some interesting patterns." She turned her laptop screen toward Reeves, displaying a detailed timeline that mapped equipment problems against decision points and information availability. For example, the communications equipment compatibility issue that Corporal Wilson discovered on Wednesday. According to the technical specification timestamps, those compatibility requirements were available in our system on Monday when we started planning, but they weren't flagged as potential problems until Wednesday afternoon, after I'd already committed to suppliers who couldn't meet the corrected specifications. Wilson's face had gone pale, but he kept his voice steady. "Sometimes technical details get overlooked in the initial review process." "Sometimes they do," Claire agreed. "But in this case, the specifications were accessed through our system on Tuesday morning and again on Tuesday afternoon. Someone reviewed them carefully before the compatibility issues were raised." She clicked to the next screen, showing access logs for the equipment databases they'd used during the planning process. Similarly, the tactical harness condition issues. The supplier's inventory system clearly indicated refurbished rather than new manufacture status, but that information wasn't communicated until after delivery had been arranged. According to the system logs, someone accessed the supplier's detailed inventory descriptions on Monday evening and again on Tuesday morning. Reeves was studying the screen with the expression of someone who'd been presented with evidence he couldn't easily dispute. System access doesn't necessarily indicate deliberate concealment of information. No, it doesn't. But when you combine the access patterns with the timing of problem identification and the consistent pattern of issues being raised after commitments had been made rather than during initial planning, it suggests coordination rather than coincidence. Claire closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. The question is whether this coordination represents a systemic failure in our planning processes, or whether it represents deliberate sabotage designed to create problems that would make the assignment appear more difficult than it actually was. The office had gone completely quiet. Martinez had stopped even pretending to work and was watching the confrontation with open fascination. Brooks looked like he wanted to disappear into his equipment catalogs, and Wilson appeared to be weighing his options for response. "That's a serious accusation," Reeves said finally. "It's not an accusation. It's an analysis of available data." Claire's tone remained professional, but there was steel underneath. "If there are systemic problems with our planning processes, we need to identify and correct them. If there are personnel issues affecting coordination effectiveness, we need to address those as well." Reeves stood and moved to the window, looking out at the base where Monday morning activities were proceeding with normal military efficiency. When he turned back, his expression had shifted from defensive to something more resigned. "What do you want, Donnelly?" "I want to understand what happened and why it happened. More importantly, I want to make sure it doesn't happen again." Claire glanced around the office at the assembled personnel. "Because if we can't coordinate a simple equipment delivery without sabotage and deliberate obstruction, how can we handle truly complex operations when they develop?" Wilson finally spoke up, his voice quieter than anyone had heard it since Claire arrived. "Maybe the problem was that we made assumptions about your capabilities based on limited information." "What kind of assumptions?" "That you were here because you couldn't handle more demanding assignments. That logistics coordination was something you were learning rather than something you'd mastered years ago." Wilson paused. "That the pendant was costume jewelry rather than something you'd earned in places where earning it mattered." The acknowledgement was grudging but genuine, and it represented more honesty than Claire had expected from someone who'd spent the previous week undermining her work. "Those assumptions led to decisions about how to handle your first major assignment," Reeves added. "Decisions that were probably unfair and definitely counterproductive." "Why?" Claire asked. "What was the point of creating problems that served no useful purpose?" Brooks found his voice for the first time in the conversation. "Testing, I guess. Seeing if you could handle pressure or if you'd fold under complications." "And if I'd folded?" The silence that followed was answer enough. If she'd failed to coordinate the equipment delivery successfully, it would have been recorded as evidence that her assignment to routine logistics work was appropriate, and that her previous experience hadn't prepared her for current responsibilities. Martinez spoke up from her desk across the room. It wasn't just about testing. It was about establishing that the existing personnel knew the systems better than someone coming in from outside. "Territorial protection," Claire summarized. "Something like that." Claire considered the explanations she'd been given, weighing them against her own observations about office dynamics and personnel relationships. The testing theory made sense, but it didn't explain the personal edge that had characterized some of the interactions. "There's something else," she said. "Something about the pendant specifically that seems to have triggered more reaction than Simple territorial concerns would justify. Reeves returned to his desk and sat down heavily. You want the whole truth? I'd prefer it. We get a lot of people through here who've had overseas assignments. Most of them spend their time telling stories about what they did and who they worked with and how important their missions were. Reeves paused. You came in here wearing a piece of jewelry that looked military, but wasn't anything we recognized. And you wouldn't explain what it was or where it came from. So you assumed I was trying to appear more important than I actually was. Something like that. And when you started handling complex coordination like it was routine, it raised questions about whether our assumptions were wrong. Questions that could have been answered by simply asking rather than by creating unnecessary problems. Yeah, Reeves admitted. They could have been. Claire looked around the office at the 4 people who'd made her first week at Camp Brennan unnecessarily difficult. She could see genuine regret in some faces, defensive uncertainty in others, and a general recognition that the situation had escalated beyond what anyone had originally intended. Here's what's going to happen going forward, she said. We're going to operate as a professional logistics coordination team. That means no more testing, no more territorial games, and no more assumptions about anyone's capabilities based on their appearance or their willingness to discuss their background. She stood and moved to the map of the base that covered most of one wall. It also means that we're going to start handling the kind of complex operations that this facility is supposed to support. Real coordination, real planning, real problem solving that serves actual mission requirements rather than personal agendas. What kind of operations? Martinez asked. Claire smiled for the first time since the conversation had started. The kind that matter. The kind that require everyone in this room to perform at their best, rather than wasting energy on office politics and personality conflicts. Reeves looked up from his desk with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that the conversation wasn't just about resolving past problems, but about preparing for future challenges. Are you saying you're staying? I'm saying that as of this morning, I've accepted a new assignment that will require significant coordination with this office. Deputy Director of Operations for the new Multi-Service Logistics Coordination Center. The announcement hit the room like a small explosion. Wilson's mouth fell open. Brooks dropped his equipment catalog, and even Martinez looked startled by the revelation. You're not leaving? Brooks asked. I'm not leaving. I'm expanding. Claire turned back to face the room. The question is whether this office is ready to support the kind of operations that the new center will be coordinating, or whether personnel changes will be necessary to ensure adequate professional standards. It was a polite way of asking whether they were prepared to work with her as a colleague and supervisor, or whether they preferred to continue the kind of behavior that had characterized her first week. Reeves stood and extended his hand. Congratulations on the promotion, Chief Warrant Officer. We look forward to supporting your operations. The handshake was firm and genuine, representing a recognition that the dynamics in the office had fundamentally changed. Wilson and Brooks offered their own congratulations, somewhat awkwardly, but with apparent sincerity. Martinez smiled broadly. I had a feeling the pendant meant something more than costume jewelry. As the morning progressed and the office settled into what felt like a new normal, Claire reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in just a few days. She'd come to Camp Brennan looking for a quiet assignment where she could avoid attention and responsibility. Instead, she'd found herself accepting one of the most challenging positions of her career. But as she watched her colleagues, former antagonists turned potential allies, begin planning for operations that would test all of their capabilities, she realized that sometimes the assignments you think you don't want turn out to be exactly what you need. The pendant caught the light as she leaned over the planning maps. And for the first time in years, She felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. 3 months later, Chief Warrant Officer Claire Donnelly stood in the newly constructed Coordination Center, watching as personnel from 4 different services worked together to manage a complex multinational training exercise. Banks of monitors displayed real-time logistics data from exercises spanning 3 states, and the air hummed with the controlled energy of an operation running exactly as planned. Master Sergeant Reeves approached with a tablet displaying the SITMING LATE's T coordination statistics. Final numbers from the NATO exercise, he reported. All equipment delivered on schedule, all personnel movements completed without delays, and all participating units report full operational readiness throughout the exercise period. Claire nodded as she reviewed the data. The numbers represented more than successful logistics coordination. They represented a fundamental transformation in how complex operations were planned and executed. Instead of crisis management and last-minute problem-solving, they'd achieved the kind of predictive coordination that made emergencies unnecessary. Any significant issues? Minor communication glitch with the Danish unit, but Corporal Wilson identified it during the pre-exercise systems check and had it resolved before operations began. Wilson had proven to be exceptionally capable once his energy was directed toward problem-solving rather than problem creation. His attention to detail and technical expertise made him invaluable for the kind of preventive coordination that the center specialized in. Specialist Martinez appeared at Claire's shoulder with another status report. Personnel rotation for next month's exercises is confirmed. All participating units have been briefed on coordination protocols, and backup systems have been tested and verified. Martinez had accepted promotion to Logistics Coordination Specialist and had become Claire's most trusted assistant for managing the complex scheduling that kept multiple operations running smoothly. Her organizational skills and diplomatic approach made her perfect for handling the inter-service coordination that could make or break joint operations. Even Private First Class Brooks had found his niche, developing an unexpected talent for equipment maintenance and preparation that ensured gear failures never disrupted training schedules. His enthusiasm for detailed work made him ideal for the kind of thorough preparation that prevented problems before they developed. Colonel Stratham entered the coordination center with the kind of satisfied expression that suggested he'd been reviewing positive reports about their operations. Chief Warrant Officer, do you have a few minutes for a briefing? They walked to Claire's office, a space that reflected the systematic approach she brought to everything she managed. Maps covered the walls, but these weren't just geographic references. They were operational networks showing the complex relationships between facilities, units, and capabilities that made large-scale coordination possible. I'd been getting calls from senior leadership at 4 different commands. Stratham began as they settled into chairs facing the operations display. Everyone wants to know how we've managed to eliminate the kinds of coordination failures that used to plague joint exercises. Systematic planning and preventive problem solving, Claire replied. Instead of waiting for problems to develop and then responding to them, we identify potential issues during the planning phase and build solutions into the operational framework. I understand the theory. What I'm curious about is the execution. How do you get personnel from different services, different countries, and different operational cultures to work together so smoothly? Claire considered the question, thinking about the transformation she'd witnessed in her own office and the similar changes she'd seen throughout the coordination center. You start by treating everyone as professionals who want to do excellent work, she said. Most coordination problems aren't caused by incompetence or lack of effort. They're caused by territorial thinking, inadequate communication, and the assumption that conflict is inevitable when different groups work together, and when those assumptions prove incorrect, People generally rise to meet the expectations you set for them. If you expect professional excellence and provide the systems to support it, most personnel will deliver professional excellence. Stratham nodded thoughtfully. Speaking of expectations, I've received authorization to expand the center's mission scope. We're being asked to coordinate logistics for humanitarian assistance operations and emergency response exercises. The expansion represented exactly the kind of challenge that would have intimidated Claire 6 months earlier. Humanitarian operations required the same systematic planning as military exercises, but with the added complexity of working with civilian agencies and non-governmental organizations that operated under completely different procedures and priorities. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Implementation begins next month. Full operational capability within 6 months. Claire felt the familiar flutter of excitement that came with accepting new challenges, but it was tempered now by the confidence that came from having built systems robust enough to handle expansion. We'll need additional personnel and expanded coordination capabilities, she said. But the framework we've developed should adapt well to humanitarian operations. I was hoping you'd say that, Stratham smiled, because I've also received authorization to offer you a permanent promotion to Chief Warrant Officer 5, an assignment as Director of the Center. The offer represented the culmination of everything Claire had worked toward throughout her military career: significant responsibility, important work, and the opportunity to build something that would continue serving long after she retired. But more importantly, it represented validation that her decision to accept challenge rather than retreat had been correct. I accept, sir. As they shook hands, Claire caught sight of her reflection in the office window. The pendant was still there, still catching the light, but it no longer felt like a weight she carried. Instead, it felt like a reminder of what was possible when competence met opportunity and courage met the chance to make a difference. Later that afternoon, Claire walked through the coordination center as the day shift prepared to hand operations over to the evening team. The transition was smooth and professional, with detailed briefings and systematic status updates that ensured nothing important would be overlooked during the shift change. Reeves stopped by her office as she was preparing to leave for the day. Chief, I wanted to thank you for giving us the chance to prove we could do better. You didn't need to prove anything to me, Tony. You just needed to stop proving things to yourselves and start focusing on the mission. Either way, this assignment has been better than anything I expected when you first arrived. Claire gathered her things and prepared to head home, but she paused at the operations display that showed the current status of coordination activities across the region. Green indicators showed successful operations. Yellow indicated routine monitoring requirements, and the absence of any red warnings confirmed that their preventive approach was working exactly as designed. 6 months ago, she'd been looking for an assignment that would let her disappear, that would allow her to contribute without standing out and serve without taking risks. Instead, she'd found herself in charge of one of the most visible and important logistics operations in her region of responsibility. But as she looked around the coordination center at the personnel who'd become not just colleagues, but partners in building something significant, she realized that trying to disappear had never been a realistic option. The pendant around her neck represented capabilities that were too valuable to waste and experiences that were too important to ignore. The drive home took her past the original supply office where her assignment at Camp Brennan had begun. Through the windows, she could see the evening shift handling routine coordination, tasks with the same systematic approach that had transformed their operations from reactive crisis management to predictive problem prevention. Wilson was at his desk, reviewing technical specifications with the thoroughness that had once been directed toward finding problems in her work, but was now focused on preventing problems in upcoming operations. Martinez was coordinating with off-base facilities. Her diplomatic skills ensuring that complex arrangements proceeded smoothly. Brooks was preparing equipment for tomorrow's exercises with the attention to detail that guaranteed nothing would fail when it was needed most. They'd all grown into roles that utilized their best capabilities while minimizing their potential weaknesses. More importantly, they'd learned to work as a team that supported individual excellence rather than demanding individual submission to group mediocrity. As Claire pulled into her driveway, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred, not just in her professional assignment, but in her understanding of what she wanted from the remainder of her military career. She'd spent so much energy trying to avoid responsibility that she'd forgotten how much satisfaction came from accepting it and using it well. The pendant caught the porch light as she unlocked her front door, and she found herself thinking about the other people who'd worn similar pendants in situations where accepting responsibility had been a matter of survival rather than career advancement. They'd faced impossible challenges not because they sought recognition, but because the mission required it, and they were the people capable of getting it done. Maybe that was the real lesson from Operation Lattice Hawk and the events that had followed. Not that extraordinary performance was unsustainable, but that it became sustainable when it was supported by adequate resources, competent colleagues, and systems designed to make success achievable rather than miraculous. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Martinez. Emergency coordination request from Fort Bragg. Nothing critical, just complex. Want me to handle it or wait for tomorrow? Claire smiled as she typed her response. Handle it. You've got this. It was a small moment, but it represented everything she'd learned about leadership, trust, and the difference between carrying responsibility alone and sharing it with people capable of carrying their fair share. The pendant settled into its familiar position as she prepared for bed, no longer feeling like a secret she had to protect or a burden she had to carry. Instead, it felt like a reminder of what was possible when competence met opportunity, when courage met challenge, and when the right people found themselves in positions where their capabilities could make a difference. Tomorrow would bring new coordination challenges, new opportunities to build systems that prevented crises rather than just responding to them, and new chances to prove that the most effective operations were those where extraordinary individual performance became unnecessary because extraordinary systematic performance made it redundant. But tonight, Chief Warrant Officer Claire Donnelly could rest with the satisfaction of knowing that her quiet assignment had become exactly what she'd needed it to be, not an escape from responsibility, but a platform for accepting it in ways that honored both her past achievements and her future potential. The pendant caught the moonlight one final time as she settled into sleep, carrying with it the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned that the best way to honor extraordinary experiences was not to hide from them, but to use them as the foundation for building something even better. Sometimes the people who seem most ordinary are the ones with the most extraordinary stories. Sometimes the quiet person in the corner is the one who's already faced the impossible and made it possible. And sometimes the best way to honor past achievements is not to rest on them, but to use them as stepping stones toward even greater accomplishments. Claire Donnelly's pendant represented more than just a classified operation that officially never existed. It represented the understanding that true strength comes not from avoiding challenges, but from building the systems and relationships that make challenging things achievable. Her story reminds us that respect should be earned through performance rather than demanded through position, that competence speaks louder than credentials, and that the most effective leaders are often those who learn that the best way to lead is to make leadership unnecessary. In the end, the pendant around her neck became not just a symbol of what she'd accomplished in impossible circumstances, but a reminder of what becomes possible when the right person accepts the right responsibility at the right time, supported by the right team working toward the right goals. Be extraordinary often hides in plain sight, waiting for the moment when ordinary circumstances require extraordinary responses. When that moment comes, the question isn't whether you're capable of rising to meet it. The question is whether you're ready to accept what that capability means for everything that comes after. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever completely misjudged someone based on first impressions? What would you have thought about Claire's pendant if you'd seen it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story reminded you that respect should be given freely until someone proves they don't deserve it, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about quiet heroes and hidden strength. And if you know a veteran whose service deserves recognition, share this video with them, because the most powerful warriors are often the ones you'd never suspect. More stories about heroes hiding in plain sight are waiting for you. Check out our playlist of inspiring military stories, workplace justice tales, and stories of people who proved that appearances can be deceiving. Until next time, remember, the quietest person in the room might have the loudest story to tell.